want to thank you for being here with us once again. We're just going to talk with you on the neglect of Nigerian colleges of education by the government. And we view this as a dangerous trend in teacher education, in the teacher education of our country. Please recall that we had cause to address you on a range of challenges confronting the colleges of education in Nigeria. The most recent of which was on 15th July this year. Sadly, the government has chosen to ignore the renewed attempt of the union to call attention to the dire situation the colleges of education system has found itself. As a union responsible for the yearnings and aspirations of the academics managing the education of the less privileged citizens, we consider it as a complicity to remain quiet in the face of the wanton neglect that has characterized the disposition of government to our plight. The persistent wanton neglect of the College of Education is evident in the non-response to the series of memos raised by the union reminding federal government of our responsibilities. While some of the issues are administrative, which we believe the regulatory agency, that is the National Commission for College of Education and the management of the colleges are expected to handle, others border on critical needs of the COE system, of the College of Education system, if we want the system that is the teacher education industry to survive. This indeed is the responsibility of government. Yet, the government chose to ignore our pleas, and that is why we have found the need to bring to the fore again some of those issues that are critical to the survival of the colleges of education system as the teacher education industry of our country. We begin with the wanton neglect, evidence of the wanton neglect. 1, the non-response to the series of memo reminding federal government of her commitment. Recall that the agitation of the union between October and November 2018 resulted in some commitments by the federal government. On December 5th, 2018, the union suspended her nationwide strike because of such commitments. Unfortunately, the federal government has failed to live up to its pledges. So between 2015, between 5th December 2018 and now, the union made spirited efforts towards making federal government commit to its obligation. Letters were written to government as represented by the Federal Ministry of Education and Federal Ministry of Labor and Employment, as well as the agencies under them with appropriate jurisdiction. But given the nonchalant response from these MDAs, the union wrote to Mr. President himself. That piece to Mr. President was published even in form of a paid advertorial, which we have here, a copy of which we have here. It's here. We had it on 2 national dailies, the Nation newspaper and then the Daily Trust. These efforts are listed below. Suspension of nationwide strike dated 5th December. The union's resolution dated to government dated 8 February 2019. Non-fulfillment of government's commitment on lingering issues dated 4th April last year, 2019. The non-implementation of Contest 15 as one of the items of the issues in contention. That one also dated 20th June last year. In July, specifically, we wrote 10th July 2019, reminding government about what we did in December, the commitments they made in December 2018, making 5 series of correspondence that we had exchanged with them. Then that culminated into the letter that we wrote to Mr. President calling for his intervention. There's not been any response from the presidency. Evidence number 3, the policy of outsourced services and its implication on colleges' security. The union's consistent reminder to the government to do the needful with respect to the 2006 outsource policy so as to cater for the security needs of the College of Education is predicated on the implication of the policy on the colleges. The refusal of federal government to provide funds to adequately remunerate the outsourced security staff and others on sundry jobs, and the inability of the colleges to afford the high cost of sourcing and funding good security outfits have made the colleges of education much more vulnerable to attack. And we need to remind you that on September 17, 2014, you recall that the Federal College of Education, Kano, was invaded. The security of the college fled. And then we had that terrible attack that killed about 20 people, 3 of the bombers, you recall. And scores were severely injured. And then at the expense of the college, the treatment and other hospital expenses were borne by the college. Shortly after the FCE Kano episode, the Federal College of Education, Kontagora, was again invaded on 12th November 2014. The college lost a final year student from the bomb blast by a suicide bomber who infiltrated the college. The trauma experienced by many residents of the staff quarters at the time still resonates, even years after the terrible experience. Many other colleges of education have had similar brushes with insecurity occasioned by the outsourced policy of government. Currently, the College of Education, Katsina Ala, is really under the menace of kidnap, which remains unattended in spite of all the representations to the state government, to Benue State government. Similarly, and worst of all, the current predicament we have can be seen in the case of Yobe State. We drew the attention of Yobe State government to the plight of Bitrus Zaka, a lecturer of Umar Suleiman College of Education, Gashua, kidnapped around Dapchi by Boko Haram elements in November 2019. But to no avail. We have the video here of that's our colleague that was kidnapped. We drew their attention. Government has refused to listen to us. Rumor is making the round. We are so concerned at this moment because rumor is making the round that our colleague may have been eliminated by the insurgents. This, to the union, is one neglect too many. Whereas the federal government had informed us in 2018 that a joint committee of the Federal Ministry of Education and the state governors had been put in place. If that committee had been in place, really, this insensitivity of the state government would have been addressed at that level. 2, the infrastructure question relative to needs assessment. Recall that a needs assessment of the public colleges of education was conducted and a report made in 2014. The implication of the report impacts on all aspects of infrastructure of the public colleges of education. The initial cost implication of the exercise was over 900 billion. However, the current administration requested a review in 2017. This was done, and a report submitted with the cost implication of about 456 billion naira. The submission was made in 2018. Quite sadly, the union had to embark on another agitation in that 2018 before a paltry pledge of 15 billion was made by government as a palliative. Again, while the union is aware that the late Chief of Staff to Mr. President made spirited efforts to get the Honorable Minister of Finance and that of Education to come to terms on the source of payment in 2018, not a farthing has been released by the federal government afterwards, and no further communication has been made with the union. More than 2 years after that recommendation by the late Chief of Staff, there's no gainsaying the implication of the non-implementation of the needs assessment report on the infrastructure of colleges. such as libraries, the laboratories, micro-teaching multimedia workshops, students' hostels, and other fast deteriorating facilities, such as lecture halls, to mention but a few. It suffices, therefore, to state that if the report had been implemented in conformity with the requisite standard, perhaps the concern over the effectiveness of our infrastructure to withstand the COVID-19 protocol would not have been a case. As we speak, most of the colleges have their student hostels in shambles. Libraries and laboratories and all those facilities that I've mentioned are devoid of the requisite consumables that they ought to have. 3, the need to review the Establishment Act of the Federal Colleges of Education. The act establishing the Federal Colleges of Education, which has been the springboard for those of the state colleges, is quite obsolete. Enacted in 1986, the law reflects the initial location of most of the colleges as against their current states brought about by the creation of states over the years. Besides, the reality of the functions of the institutions belie the conception of their mandate. By implication, most of the services of these institutions could be conveniently termed illegal in the face of the law because the act itself is obsolete. Thus, the situation has made it imperative for a review of the act to reflect such realities. So, with the agitation of 2018, there was an expeditious passage of that bill by the National Assembly, by the 7th National Assembly. Sadly, it was not transmitted to Mr. President for assent. Hence, the need for the 8th National Assembly to institute a fresh legislative process as a matter of urgency to enact the law. We are the one reminding government of its responsibilities. This ought to have been an executive bill, but the union had to take it up, and it was passed, but not sent to Mr. President for assent. It ought to have been actually an executive bill to Mr. President. Need for the current National Assembly to enable a fresh legislative process towards a speedy passage of the bill as repackaged by us in conjunction with National Commission for Colleges of Education. 4th is the stalled renegotiation of the 2010 federal government Coeasu agreement. Collective bargaining agreements by the International Labour Organization Convention are binding on all parties and subject to renegotiation every 5 years. By implication, ours should have been due for renegotiation in 2014 and last year, 2019. The federal government is in serious default of that process. With the agitation of the union, the renegotiation commenced in 2017, but got stalled unilaterally by the federal government. No explanation has been offered howsoever. The implication of the stalled process is that the conditions of service to which the academic staff of the colleges of education have been subjected is quite obsolete. In other words, the document ought to have been renegotiated twice to usher in fresh conditions of service. 5, the question of funding. The gross underfunding of the College of Education had been abysmally consistent with the federal government. Quite unfortunately, state governments toe the line of federal government in this regard. It could be said that the federal government encourages irresponsibility towards funding obligations. Credence to this can be seen in the ministerial appointment of a former governor known to have paid ridiculous salaries and emoluments to the staff of two colleges of education in his state. At the expiration of his office, the federal government compensated him for meritorious service in quote, with the ministerial appointment, in spite of owing 38 months' salary without utilizing the bailout which federal government gave him to cater for the salary. The issue of funding affects the system in all ramifications. For example, between 2012 and 2017, the funds released as capital allocation to colleges of education by the federal government stood at about 56%. The releases of federal government stood at 56% as against the budgeted sum between 2012 and 2017. This is an indication of the abysmal, arbitrary allocation they offer the colleges of education subsector. Tell me, how can they move? Why would the infrastructure not dilapidate as fast as it's been done? A little while before then, the that is the period in question, especially from 2006 to 2008, the totality of the allocation of the College of Education relative to other sister institutions was appalling. With the relative huge allocation, while the relatively huge allocation to the universities, which we can understand anyway, for obvious reasons of their enormous responsibilities and then quite divergent salaries, cannot be compared with ours. But sadly, even that of the polytechnics is higher than what the teacher education industry of this country was allocated. You will see a graph that we have given you there to spare you. There's a table, and the table that you find in the text will give you the figures. And then you see the graph there that will tell you, the yellow one there that you see is that of the allocation to the colleges as represented in this graph. Currently, federal government has been manipulating the academic staff salary with the imposition of the integrated personnel payroll information system in several ways. From the unilateral stop of payment of academic staff on sabbatical leave to the imposition of the non-negotiable personal income tax, the over-deduction of payable amount of contributory pension scheme, and other sundry deductions. Then other impropriety which the IPs has engendered is the non-remittance of third-party deductions, especially for staff cooperative societies and such other things as the union check-off dues, in contravention of its own laws, especially the Trade Union Act 2005 as amended. These recurring challenges engendered by IPs reaffirms the union's earlier conviction against the implementation of the pay platform in colleges of education as a tertiary institution, and thus strengthens our resolve to remain opposed to it. Alternatively, a model consistent with tertiary education administration and management should be developed for the tertiary education subsector. From the foregoing, it is quite evident that the union's agitation is an existential struggle geared towards revitalization of the College of Education system as the basic teacher education industry, as the main entity for the training of the teachers and managers of the foundation level of the nation's education system. The sustained neglect of colleges of education portends a grave implication for the development of the entire education sector. You know, that is, we take care of the foundation level. If the foundation is shaky, can you have a good edifice to collapse? So the union is hereby formally declaring that all options are open for industrial action against the federal government and some of those notorious state governments that have refused to implement extant laws, the statute that ought to move the colleges of education forward. The public should take notice that the NEC shall reconvene to reel out the series of measures that the union shall take towards bailing the College of Education from the doldrums and further decadence inherent in the wanton neglect by the government. Thank you. We'll take inquiries. What universities have that is peculiar is their handling of postgraduate studies and all that go with it. So whatever system developed by them, we know they've developed UTAS, that it can work perfectly in other tertiary education institutions. Then on your second question, it goes beyond just calling for a sack or resignation of just the minister. If you really know the problem that has bedeviled the education sector. And why are we saying this? Because we have a lot of insight. The governance of education in our country is not as simple as that. The problems have been there, you recall, for decades. The 2010 agreement that we have, and some of those issues there that are yet to be implemented have been there even before 2010. Still, this government has not been able to address them. We should begin to ask ourselves why. I'm aware that authorities higher than the ministry have been presented with reports emanating from our subsector on the dire situation we find ourselves. Why have they not been addressed? The issue is not as simple as asking for the head of the minister or for the minister to resign. To me, it's the whole government that has failed Nigerians. Why is ASU on strike? Why has the Polytechnic threatened strike? Why is SANU threatening strike in conjunction with NASU? It's not only Coeasu, it's not peculiar. Then we should begin to ask ourselves, why have these problems been there? The issue is the government entirely has failed Nigerians with regards to education, the education of the education sector of the country. It's not a one-man thing. Started from today. There are a range of industrial action as perceived by public is usually more often than not a strike. But in this case, as a teacher organization, we are trying to impact on our system positively, while also trying to address the challenges different from the way people had understood it. So we have a range of actions ahead. NEC had to ratify that, but by this press conference, they are already on notice. The government is already on notice that our action has begun. And like I said, all the community services in the institutions have ceased henceforth till further notice. Yeah. But like all options are on the table, including the last resort, which is a strike. Full scale. We'll take your responses, and if there's none, I want to thank you so much. I said it in the passing there, the issue of the pension scheme. As we speak now, the group life insurance, that the law establishing the federal colleges is just one law, unlike that of the universities that have individual university laws. Ours is one, and it has empowered the colleges to engage their underwriter. As we speak with you, the federal government of Nigeria has over-centralized that. They are the ones to appoint the underwriters and the insurers. These people have refused to pay the entitlement of our colleagues that have died. Most of their families are wallowing in abject poverty occasioned by the non-payment of the entitlement of the deceased. Government has refused, particularly the head of service. The office of the head of service of the Federation has refused to allow our people to have the ease of life by paying them and instructing the people they have appointed as insurers and underwriters to do the needful. This issue is there. Even though it's said in the past in what you have, but this issue is there, and the federal government has still been paying lip services to it. We will no longer take all this. I think it's okay.
Pension benefits. 18 months. They have not.
Are you saying that all is well?
Well, that's what we're saying. We're not saying it's well. That's why we're saying the government had failed Nigerians. The government itself has failed. Okay, you are not around. Okay, let get it clearly. The question was raised by you, one of you, whether the minister should. I said it's not a question of just the minister. We are aware that offices higher than the ministry have been presented with the challenges of the colleges of education. It's a failure of the entire government. The failure that we are witnessing in the education sector is not peculiar to that of the colleges of education. If you are saying it's peculiar, why are the universities on strike? Why has the Polytechnic threatened? Why is SANU and NASU trying to embark on strike? The problems inherited by this government in the education sector, the challenges are still there, even 5 years down the line. And that is why we are saying the entire government has failed, not just the minister. Even we have started. Sorry, please get something clearly. Sorry, please get it very clearly. Get it very clearly. The minister, ideally, in civilized climes, if your principal does not listen to you, you simply resign honorably. This is it. Is that not? But we're having a situation, a peculiar situation here, where we are aware that the entire government is what has failed Nigerians in terms of its responsiveness to the yearnings and aspirations of Nigeria in education. That is why you find the entire education sector in shambles. The other time they said they were starved of funds. What did they do? They went to UBEC and slashed for God's sake. Which country would reduce the budget of its education in the face of problem. You rely on the education sector towards solving your problems, towards developing your future generations. But in our own case, all the problems in the education sector are still there unattended. That is why you are witnessing what you are witnessing. And let's get something correct. Industrial actions are not just strikes. No, it's just a last strike is usually a last resort. Even by this declaration today, like we said before you came, our people are already aware. Government is put on notice. The public is put on notice that we are on an industrial action. And the first industrial action is suspension of our services in the colleges, henceforth, from today. Others, like we said, we will have to be approved by the NEC. And we said it will cut across the 6 geopolitical zones. So it's a strike. But when we say we're having it was just not on national strike.
That, of course, it is. It is obvious that ASU itself is on strike. But it is not felt by the public because the children are...
No, they didn't ask that question. Let's limit
It's
ourselves.
obvious that ASU strike is mature. The moment of maturity of strike is not felt by the public because the federal government is hiding under COVID-19, this COVID-19 syndrome. As soon as schools reopen,
No, we didn't.
I'm sorry, classes may not reopen.
It's not
This
in our
is a
text.
clear statement.
It's not in the text.
Except if government happens. But government is hiding behind the needle, the COVID-19 syndrome. That is just clear. But this is to enlighten and enlighten the society,
We expect them to
the Nigerian community,
put it here. Let's limit
about
ourselves to this.
what obtains currently. Total neglect, abject deprivation of the quality of education system. The bedrock of Nigerian educational development is being threatened for survival. If you look at the barrage of demands, it has run through the years. And total neglect. We have a government that you will write to. We have a government that you give ultimatum to. You have a government that you communicate to. You have a government that you lobby to, and there will not be a reply. It has been a game of the deaf and the dumb, playing with the deaf and the dumb. And that's why we are adopting this media, which listens, this media that sympathizes more with the public, this media that is the ear and the eye of the public, to speak to the public, probably for the deaf and the dumb to us, the dumb to listen, because the education in this country is in danger. And that's why the president has announced ASU, Coeasu, SANU, everybody has a threatened strike hanging. But government is hiding under the fact of not reopening schools. Probably the threats on ground, the inability and the privations of the institutions are what we're hiding. So that when schools do not open, the strike will not become obvious. However, the time is made. The time is near. We are eager to go back to work, but government is still hiding under that fact. We may not be able to go back to work. This is a government that has not funded any institution to fumigate, to put in place structures that will admit students. And it is now promising to the public that schools will soon reopen. And yet institutions and chief executives are yet to be funded to fumigate. In fact, if the schools now reopen, that means they are going to put these students into danger. It's part of the neglect and deprivations. A responsive government should come forward to state clearly what it intends to do. The other alternative is to ask parents to come and fumigate the classrooms of their children, of the public institutions themselves, if they want schools to reopen. They are yet to develop to have such a courage to do that. That is the situation.
Where are even the classrooms?
This itself is a form of industrial action.
It is. It is.
Otherwise,
Not
we are
just
supposed.
right.
If it's a responsive government, by now we should call it a press conference to praise government for what it has done for the system.
For the past 5 years.
But we have
nothing.
nothing to show for it.
Five years.
Total
down.
neglect, total silence. It takes 6 months to see and cite the Minister for Education. We know efforts have been taken and some persons are just snubbing. We know the setup there that education is not even on the list of the priorities. And that is a danger against the society itself. Not even for us, but for the Nigerian youths that are aspiring to develop, for the survival of the Nigerian system that must have educated youths. The idle hands currently are exposed, are threats to the Nigerian community, and we cannot for long keep these students at home. We cannot for long keep these students at home, even in the dire consequences of the strike that government is forcing the unions to go into.
Thank you. Well, thank you.